Recording in progress.
Alex. No, hang on.
Greetings.
How are you?
Pretty well.
Good.
It's a little hot.
Yeah, how's the weather been over there?
Well, I mean, no, but bit of a thunder weather. Well, I guess it's hot in other places too, but
yeah,
beginning to be summer-like.
Good.
Hello.
Hey.
Hello.
Mr. Luskin, you look pretty sharp with the beard trim. I like it.
Yeah, and then I'm cleaning things up. Figure as the world is slowly coming back from the apocalypse, it was time for a cleanup.
But why?
Well, you always want to look good at the end times.
Yeah, if you're worried about such things. There.
Yeah, look, he's like a
Yeah.
he's like the baby
You
face.
can hear us.
You're a baby face.
Yeah, well, no, if I shave, I can take like 15 years off of me.
I miss the like burly mountain man. Like
I gotta be able to change the appearance as necessary.
I know. You have to be able to, disguise yourself.
I was getting to a place where it was starting to feel like I had gone from like eccentric professor to the homeless guy on campus.
Because then
And so I was like, all right, time to work on this.
All right, I'm gonna have to do mine too a little.
no.
Oh, just a little.
The bad thing is women don't have that option.
That's you.
How's that a bad thing?
Well,
Sounds like a good thing to me.
I guess there is, facelifts. Not doing that. Makeup. Why would I wear makeup?
Bearded ladies.
There's always bangs versus Botox, which is
Yeah. Yeah, I guess I could do, this number.
There you go.
Ugh. I have to put it up when I'm working in the yard or in the attic. Oh, God. Excuse me a moment.
No problem. All right, so I'm gonna guess most everybody's probably here who's gonna be here. How's everyone doing this evening? Good to see you. Good to see a bunch of recurring faces. Good to see a few long-term faces. Juan, glad to see you.
Hello.
Hope things have been well.
I'm not going for the ring look.
Very well, thank you.
Good. So tonight's kind of the last piece from the sovereignty and stages, stages of initiation conversation. After this, we've still got a bunch of stuff to go with in this book, but this is sort of the end of the kind of big four phases in people's development. And in some ways, you're going to see this, and I'm going to do the reading, that way we're all on the same page. But you're going to see with this that to some extent, like suddenly at this last stage, the other ones are about, essentially getting your shit together personally, getting your shit together in the world, helping other people get their shit together. And the fourth phase is kind of this stuff you can't get together. That there are just certain things, even in advanced stages of development, that remain at play and that change the things that have been concerning you. So in terms of doing this, I'm just going to start the reading. It's a little bit longer than the other ones, but not by a whole bunch. So, royal power in the inner world. Consider what sort of things have been obtained by this point. By now, initiates have gained control of their environments. They can place themselves in such situations as lead to productive ordering of their inner world. They have learned how to learn. They can choose activities in the world that cause their inborn talents and strengths to flourish. They have learned how to grow. They have learned how to teach others the first two steps by word and by example. They have learned how to initiate. By now they can take on the inner darkness and make it glow with their own self-created light. Human beings are besieged by four self-fears. After they have met their outward directed fears, fear of want, fear of violence, fear of abandonment, and so forth, the inner directed fears remain. Among the inward directed fears are fear of the unknown impulse, or the imp of the perverse, fear of the future, fear of wasted time, and finally, fear of the unverifiable. Each of these fears stop action, sours life, and limits one's sovereignty. Let us identify each in turn and explain how the fourth phase of initiation gives opportunity to overcome these fears. Fear of the unknown impulse. How many times has your life taken an uncertain turn based on no clear reason? You decided to go to a store on impulse and you met your spouse. You decided to pick up a slip of paper on the floor and you found your college major. You disagreed with a family member over the Thanksgiving dinner menu and wound up with a fight that scarred both of you for life. The left-hand path magician comes to realize that such slips and seeming accidents are the key to power. This does not mean that he or she believes that every event is fated. It means that learning to control one's life rationally becomes a talisman to effect control of the hidden aspects of life as well. Thus, magicians will enter a phase where none of their actions are random or accidental, and learn to watch themselves as a great source of mystery, from which even more being can be gained. Fear of the future. We are compelled to act, but not know the consequence of our actions. As humans, we deal with this as a form of auto-hypnosis called cognitive dissonance. We learn to justify our choices. So each movement towards freedom actually becomes a movement towards binding one's life on the outer directed notion of one's history. Given the abilities that have been obtained by this stage in initiation, the initiate can now actually abandon cognitive dissonance and take full responsibility for the future by admitting that it is unknown. It is the great darkness out of which all things are manifest. The initiate, armed with their inner strengths, can learn to act in such a manner that will make them feel good about their choices. This simple sounding state is one of the most difficult to accomplish, but when it comes, a certain power, a certain confidence flows from the initiate that causes all around them to follow him or her. Fear of wasted time. By the time in our lives that we have reached the fourth stage of initiation, we are already experiencing the dimming of youth. We have begun to hear death sniggering rather plainly, and we are apt to be caught in the fear of wasted time. Do I spend my time learning the runes, starting a new business, solving my family dilemma? The experiences of the three types of sovereignty gained so far must be used now to learn the life lesson, that if you continue to act with an initiatory attitude, all life experiences can be used in the quest for sovereignty. The choice is not finding the right thing to do, it's finding the right attitude that informs your actions. Fear of the unverifiable. All humans on any religious or philosophical path fear that in the end there is no proof of what is believed. The quest for immortality might be a unicorn hunt. The quest for sovereignty might be a good psychology for motivating ourselves for years. But this fourth stage of the quest for sovereignty gives us the test of our ideas. As we begin to unlock the darkness within, our accidents and slips begin to take us to places where the truth of our lives can be uncovered. As we exude confidence, we attract the type of seeker who wants to put forth what we have, so we have a living laboratory to see if our ideas work. As we discover the nature of attitude, we begin to understand what has gone on in our lives and who we are. We forgive ourselves for wasted time and learn how to make the remaining decades of our lives powerful and joyous. These states give us the proof of our subjective state. Unlike a right-hand path prophet who must imagine that he hears a voice in the burning bush, we hear our own voice explaining our lifestyles. Throughout mankind's history, men and women have obtained to this fourth level of initiation. They have been, are, and will be the true Black Order, who by their strivings bring new impulses to the earth while living and beyond, and thus affect the work of the Prince of Darkness in creating the historical conditions needed for certain qualities to come to exist in mankind, such as bravery, curiosity, love, and contemplation. This order has many outward names, but only one essence. These four phases of the quest for sovereignty have two things in common. First, they are not entirely linear. And secondly, we always believe that we have obtained and mastered them years before we do so. The first leads to great discoveries early in the magical career, and it is a blessed thing. The second leads to laziness and arrogance, and is accursed by all true philosophers. So, final secrets of the Illuminati, we're good. All done now, kids. I think a lot of the biggest piece that kind of comes at this part of this discussion is really looking at that kind of long-term sustaining. Like, what is it beyond the things that got the rocket initially propelled into taking certain actions in your life? The claiming of your own physiology, psychology as your own, the building the world in a way that supports you, in a way that supports your ideas, learning to teach other people. I think you get to a point in all of this, and that this fourth phase in some ways is about, where it's really confronting all the things that you haven't been able to confront up until then, because you were doing so many other things. You have very effectively done a lot of things in the world, but this fourth phase is partially the result of, almost, since we're talking in an occult sensibility around this, you have magicked yourself into a corner that you cannot get out of by the things that got you there. And so you finally have to confront all the things you didn't want to confront in your life. All the kind of bits and pieces that you put aside, that you kind of pretended hadn't been there. There's this kind of fourth thing that's rising up and kind of pushing all that back into awareness. It's like, nope, you got to deal with all of this. You can't use cheesy occult solutions to these big questions, because these big questions are bigger than the things that got you here. And I think for a lot of people, this kind of, the notion of royal power in the inner is probably the hardest and rarest piece of things, but at the same time also one of the most instantaneously accessible. Like the other phases require a lot of work. People will accidentally get to a temporary state awareness of the same thing, just in like brief moments of suddenly realizing, what the fuck am I doing? How did I get here? What's going on in this moment? And those feelings, like it's like we've all at different points have probably had those moments where it felt like the universe was trying to talk to us directly. And some of it is that kind of temporary state experience of the same thing, where your perceptual universe and your sense of identity end up uniting temporarily. And you can kind of get these moments where it feels like the whole narrative is finally getting explained to you. And either that makes you cry or it makes you laugh. And usually it's this kind of perverse version of both. There's a line from Robert Anton Wilson about, you don't understand something until you don't. An insight isn't true if it doesn't make you laugh, but you don't really understand it until it makes you cry. That there are certain types of insights that you're going to have that will happen to you that are these combined moments of brilliance and darkness. And I think this kind of fourth phase that's being discussed at this point is probably one of the biggest effects of that, but I think that it shows up for people across their whole development. They will have temporary bursts of this kind of awareness. It's odder for people who get to a point where that becomes the kind of center of gravity of who they are. But even then, folks who, fairly developed people, they're not doing that all the time. Like most people are spending like the majority of their life dealing with the inner and outer rulership issues that we've already discussed. Like the big ticket stuff, that happens occasionally. Sometimes you need to align yourself to do that kind of work, but that's not what you're doing most of the time.
Okay.
So I can keep rambling. So if anybody wants to jump in here, feel free.
A quick question. How do
Sure.
epiphanies fit into this? Say someone has a spiritual epiphany late in life. Does that change this whole stages of sovereignty?
No, I don't think necessarily. I think it varies a little bit because the term gets used without a lot of specificity. Modern usage mostly derives from James Joyce rather than from any particular religious tradition. But the idea of those kind of epiphantic awakenings, it's at that point, I think for most people, what is usually happening at that moment is that they're getting to a place where who they are, their access to their being, we don't have good language for this, so we have to use a bunch of archaic philosophy. We kind of left this topic alone for a few centuries. But in terms of, the self has grown to a place where whatever it has used to grow to that point is no longer what it needs in its environment. It's gotten to a point where it's kind of outgrown the thing that let it grow up in the first place. And those kind of moments of epiphany are often a case of suddenly realizing that, like, oh, the thing that let me grow to this isn't the thing I'm going to need to do next. The part of me that got me to this place in my life is not what I'm going to need to do in the next part of my life. Or in a more visceral kind of metaphor that ties back to some of the Setian mythic imagery, there is a certain point in the gestation process where a baby is fully formed and about to get born, and the single biggest risk and danger in its existence is the womb that had allowed it to grow. That thing is going to try and kill them, and it needs somebody to act as an intervening force in order to make sure that life comes out. And that's that whole idea of, in the Setian imagery, there's that pronged dagger, sometimes referred to as a peshkent dagger, which is traditionally the weapon of Set used to fight Apep, but it's also the weapon used to cut umbilical cords. And that's part of that same kind of idea that, the matrix you grow in will get to a place where it's toxic and you have to get expelled from it. And sometimes you need an intervening force to help you get out of that. But a lot of like people's epiphany, well, aside from some people's epiphanies are just like midlife crises in disguise. But a lot of people, when they're having epiphanies, it's a version of that. It's whatever grew them to that point is not the thing they're going to need in order to keep going forward.
Can I ask what that looks like in a person's life?
Well, in terms of like somebody who's had that kind of realization, or
Yeah, like what can you think of an example of somebody who has magically painted themselves into a corner? Like what would be the next step that they would need to take?
Well, I think on the kind of pragmatic part of that, when people have kind of gotten there, the way I used to try to explain it to people is that in some ways it's almost like you've gotten to a place where you're thinking thoughts so big you need other people's brains to help think them. That, and that's where, and the piece kind of mentions it, the idea that, you will find people who, the things that you have worked on that were the things that transformed you, suddenly you have to start teaching them to other people who are willing and interested in trying to see if they can apply that out in the world. And I think that that's part of a lot of times what you'll kind of see at that same phase. And the other thing is just that person having to turn around and address all the things that they hadn't been. There was a metaphor from Don Webb as well about some of these same stages. And it's kind of a metaphor about having a house. And, the first phase is essentially like, oh, hey, I have a house, I should fix it up. And the second phase is my neighbors are crazy and I should do something to kind of interact with them so that I can protect my house. And, the third phase is, I think there's something in the attic and it's kind of staring me. And the fourth phase is finally going like, I've got a buttload of stuff in my basement that I've been ignoring my entire life and I have to go finally clear this out. And I'm going to have to go recruit other people to help me do this. And that's a lot of times what you sort of see when people are dealing with that kind of rulership at the inner is a major thing that they're dealing with. They're not doing it alone. They're starting, and not in the same way that kind of third phase of royal power in the outer, of finding people and, finding people who can be students that can become peers and all that. It's the larger case of like, well, I've learned a bunch of learned a whole bunch of meta structures in the course of my existence, in the course of my experience. And I'm going to try showing them to other people to find out if they actually mean something or if this is just some crazy me thing. And you start seeing the larger pattern. If it works well, you can sort of see the pattern of people taking those ideas, taking those meta patterns, but applying them uniquely into their own lives. And you can still see that they have the same, like they're clearly marked by what this thing is, but their end result is uniquely their own. It's not just a repeat of whoever the person trying to act as a teacher in this capacity was doing. If everybody's coming to the exact same end, something's gone wrong. And if the teaching is really sound, it's going to iterate in unique ways rather than, turning everybody into exactly the same creature with the same library, the same jokes, all that kind of stuff, which is sometimes a lot of occult organizations are built to, essentially turn you into good company men of one kind or another, and then kind of send you off to keep iterating the same thing because you don't matter. You as a carrier of these ideas is what matters. And, really dealing with this kind of phase in someone's initiation doesn't reflect that. It starts reflecting the big meta themes in a way that somebody has been able to isolate and can teach it to somebody else. And then there's some other, the book doesn't go into it. There's some phases after the four that are discussed here, but like the big one at this kind of like fourth phase of things in some ways is I figured out something enough that I think I have a sense of, what the meta story for myself is and what it might be for other people. And I'm going to find the people that need that to become themselves only more so. And that part of that act of getting other people into what it is that you've been experimenting with, trying to, take the shots to see if these things will do what they think it will do, starts teaching you more about what your own experience has been, starts teaching you a sense of, usually in ways that you didn't expect. Like you've gotten to the point where it's like, no, I don't know what the outcome is going to be. I'm going to tell you that these were the things that changed me and you're going to try doing them yourselves, but I don't know what the outcome is. And I think that that's actually one of the big pieces of importance in this little written part from Don, deals with that idea that, the future is unknown ultimately. And the best teachers, particularly the best meta teachers at this kind of level, are the people who, when you ask them, well, what's going to happen? Very like, wow, we have to know what the answer is. And they're like, don't know. I don't know any more than you do. There's a handful of jokes out of the Zen tradition. It's actually one of the reasons I like Zen is that they like going for, screwball humor. But there is a story of, someone very intensely going up to this, notable Zen master and, furious in this pursuit of this understanding and going to the Zen master and being like, Zen master, what happens when we die? And Zen master goes, don't know. They're like, but how is that possible? You goes the whole lineage, blah 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 blah. It's like, but you're this kind of Zen master. And the Zen master is like, yes, I'm a Zen master, but I'm not a dead Zen master. I don't know what happens. And I think that that honesty and the ability to be honest about those elements, how much of it is unguaranteed, how much of it is a crapshoot, that's often a hallmark of genuine teaching. When you run into teachers who think they have all the answers, you got a real problem. And if they're really convinced of it, you may end up with some, variation of the, hey, we're gonna go get a compound in Guyana. Bring the flavor aid. It's gonna be great. Just because certainty, if somebody gets to a certain phase and they get too certain about their own stuff, and they're not willing to admit the unknowns anymore, there's often it's a strange thing to say, there's a lot of coherence for those people. Like if you look at, cult leaders in the kind of broad sense of that category, they're as crazy as everybody else and all their stuff is complete nonsense, but it's really coherent in this crazy kind of way. And humans love coherency. Like we think it's why we like math. Like we love coherent shit. Like when all the pieces fit together, it's like, yes. And the thing about reality is the more coherent something is, the less tied to reality it probably is. And so the pursuit of that kind of coherency starts moving at odds with reality, and people will substitute the mental coherency they feel about those things in place of actual reality. The leader has all the answers because they have contact with a cosmic connection that nobody else does. And there's no way that they can be wrong. So we're going to figure out how to make all of this true. And it doesn't matter that, the volcanoes he said happened, X number of years ago didn't exist at that time. It has to be true because this was the person who knew all the real things. We love those kinds of coherent narratives, but they're deadly because they often take you away from what reality is. And you see that on a bigger cultural level, you'll see that even the way that societies talk about their own stories. It's just that we live in an unusual time where, population sizes and information exchange is, enormous in both capacities, that the big meta narratives don't really work. So you basically get tribes of people with slightly different meta narratives all trying to act like they have the one true understanding of the universe, and it's all just a crapshoot. The various meta narratives are just storytelling mechanisms that people use to get through their days, which is fine. That's the conditions that we have to be in. And I don't necessarily think folks who lived in times that had really good coherent meta narratives necessarily had better lives for it. Or at least historically, most periods when people did have good coherent meta narratives, they all died in their 30s, so it didn't really matter.
I have a question about environment. And I think this relates a lot to this chapter. But like for me personally, for example, I'm trying to put myself into a new environment where I'm surrounded by more people who share my ambitions. And I think environment is crucial for making things happen with magic and without magic. Being in an environment that's conducive to that thing happening that you want to happen. I'm wondering if you have any insights on identifying or selecting good environments for one's needs or work.
Some of that really will vary on your own sensibilities, because what you need may not be what someone else needs. So having a sense of, do I feel like this is making me thrive more if I looked at the other people I'm interacting with? Are they not necessarily that you want exactly what they have, but like, are they achieving things in a scale comparable to what you're trying to deal with? Are you the smartest monkey in the room? And it doesn't just mean in one line. Like in most situations, it's not uncommon for people to be the smartest monkey in a room about a single topic or a single style of thinking. But like, if you're a big book consuming brainiac, find people who are musicians, find people who are artists, find people who have domain capacities you don't have that you can interact with, so that you can get a better idea of what it means to be smart in other ways. In some ways, there's in the kind of corporate consulting and personal development field, there's a shorthand that you are the sum of the 5 people you talk to all the time. And usually if you look at about where your economic standing is, where your education level is, how successful you are, if you dealt with the 5 people who you spend the most time talking to, you're probably all kind of in a similar condition. And that's where sometimes you do have to change who are the 5 people you're talking to all the time. It may mean some people you got to listen to a little less. We've all got that one friend that never got on with their lives. And it's important to have them in your life. Like, you do not need to alienate everybody that has been important to you, but you have to know where the guy that never got over being 16, like, maybe you don't want to take life advice from him. But maybe you also don't want to be giving it to him because he's not going to do anything with it. It's just making his life worse. So knowing when to interact with folks on that. But like for the big self-change stuff, find other people who've got some similar values and who look like they're kind of heading in a direction that is at least roughly similar to where you're trying to go. In terms of bigger environments, in terms of places to interact with, I think that's going to change depending on what you're trying to do. It's the same way that, like, if you're trying to learn how to be a really good scuba diver, Nevada is probably not a great place to do it. The same notion. You want to deal with deserts, Iceland, not a good choice. So realizing what it is that you're trying to accomplish and what context you may need to put yourself in, so that some of it just happens as a result of wherever you are. Rather than it being something you have to do, it becomes something that kind of comes part and parcel with what you're trying to do.
That's interesting. I'm almost getting like that there's a way to sort of invoke synchronicity, that if you kind of put yourself somewhere where you might discover a new setting, that synchronicities can happen. That's a really good idea. Thank you.
Synchronicity is one of those topics that I think gets a lot of misunderstanding, because there's a lot of woofy-farkle bullshit that is out there on this topic. If you look at the base, the simplest level of what Jung was trying to speak of about it, it's the idea of meaningful coincidence. Coincidence is happening all the time. It's just random crap going on in the universe. But your ability to make meaning out of the seemingly random things that are going on around you is kind of what matters. 2 people standing in the same place, one of whom has a head full of archaic lore from Scandinavian mythology, and the other person who has no idea of that. And they're having a conversation about, just like a brief conversation about like Scandinavian mythology, and there's a sudden thundercrack. The mythologist is going to have this head full of ideas around Thor and, the Numinous and all this other person. And the other person's going to be like, I don't know why you're freaking out about this. Like, because none of this is meaningful to me. It's like, yeah, lightning bolt. That's nice. So synchronicity is one of those things that it's a function of consciousness. It's a function of meaning making. It's not a thing that the universe is throwing out there, because the universe doesn't care about meaning. It's not what it does. The loci of where meaning comes from for humans is within the psyche itself. We make meaning out of events. We make, meaning out of seemingly random occurrences. And if, depending on how you're looking at it, if you have a fairly good sense of what your desires are, what your purpose is, or, different people need slightly different language to attach themselves to it. But if you have a good handle on that, you have a specific kind of desire, the world, it connects you to a certain extent to a kind of patterns of what's already occurred in the past, the likelihood of certain outcomes. And so it's almost like your desires tie you to certain narratives. And then the trick is figuring out what story you're in and learning how to really do it well. Some folks of us are living tragedies, some folks of us are living farces. Occasionally it's this kind of weird mix of the two. I've been stuck in this middle brown novel for years. That figuring out what you want and figuring out what story you're in will give you a better idea about what you need to be doing sometimes than almost anything else will. It'll give you a sense of what's meaningful for you.
Cool. Gave me lots to think about. Thanks.
Careful, folks. If you don't start saying something, I'm just going to start singing show tunes, and I don't have a singing voice.
I was going to say, one of the things you got to remember is that what you find meaningful at one stage of life will become meaningless in
Oh, yeah.
the next stage. And there's no cut and dried division between those times,
Yeah.
whether, those stages of life, they kind of flow, merge, and sometimes repeat if you're not careful.
Didn't learn it the first time. You're back here again.
Gotta hate those Saturn returns.
Well, I think that there is also, as people develop, a lot of times, like, and it goes to some extent back to that kind of, womb metaphor, that the things that are really the things, like the subject of self that you identify with, even now, your sense of self, it's right at this moment, at some point, is going to become an object that you can consider, because you will have grown into a different kind of subjectivity. So in a sense, the subjects of one stage of your development become the objects of your next stage, because you can kind of look back and see the things that you shed to become whoever you have to become next, and can kind of play with some of the stuff of like, oh, well, this is who I was, but now this is this object I can interact with, even in terms of like people who go through phases of like strong fandom on a given topic, or they've like fallen in love with a given album, for a moment, like that's the only thing they can kind of keep in their head. And like you run into them a few years later, and like they can dial it up if they need to easily, the content that used to really, make them passionate, but they probably don't feel the same way about it. And that's part of that same kind of, that subject of one phase becomes the object of the next, that as you grow, you are shedding some of the things that allowed you to grow, because they were, kind of like if you look at a construction site, there's often the kind of scaffolding and structures that are put up around the construction to allow you to make the thing. But at some point, the scaffolding has to come down.
Right.
Otherwise, you were just building scaffolding. If you've spent a lot of time in New York, there's a few buildings where you might suspect they were actually scaffolding projects. So, occasionally that does happen. Projects get abandoned midway. Humans do that to their own development a lot. But, at a certain point, whatever you've been using to help you build what you're trying to build, you have to actually, move into it and bring down the scaffolding and move on to whatever is supposed to happen in the next part of things.
Yeah, I have a question. With the phases of life and the moving as an initiate, one and balancing the solventies, that the inner outer solventies and other solventies that you encounter. There's always the question of maintaining your inner child. Are you killing it off, your inner child, your inner sense of wonder? That's part of you as a full person, is this inner child. You don't want to lose that, or lose other aspects of yourself that you passed through. So, I mean, it sounds like you're almost killing off part of yourself to move forwards.
No, I don't necessarily think so. One, I'm mixed on that kind of like parts metaphors. Like, the inner child was primarily a kind of 1980s, new age idea, which was, and it's not that it's useless, but it's a kind of attempt to create parts within your awareness. The only problem that I have with that kind of approach is usually there's no parts integration at the end. Like, it's a really good idea to clarify the different things in your head and build the kind of like metaphoric structures, but at some point you got to reassemble them. But I don't think like people's sense of wonder shouldn't be tied to childhood. Like, I don't know why an adult wouldn't be able to experience wonder, and why that needs to be tied to notions of childhood, particularly since, I personally, I actually had a largely idyllic childhood as far as I was concerned, but like I know a lot of people who didn't, and the notion of them attempting to tie themselves to what their inner childhood experience was is going to be toxic and pollute most of their existence. It's the idea behind it, that idea of trying to connect to your sense of innocence and wonder and a certain wholesomeness, I get. I think the metaphor is fractured and potentially damaging. That said, I don't think that you need to, just give all this stuff away. I don't think that you have to give up the notion of of your capacity for wonder. I don't think you should give up your notion for your capacity for kind of wholesomeness in the sense of, the kind of wholeness of your being. I don't think that has to go away. I think the bad metaphors have to go. The things that were, there's a really brilliant idea from the Church of the Subgenius, referred to as the short duration personal savior. It was a kind of short-term fanaticism that could allow you to, for if you were trying to work on your stuff, like you had a particular set of issues you were trying to work out, like, we'll keep with weird childhood experiences. Like you had traumatic experience, your parents got killed in a criminal act, and suddenly Batman becomes your short duration personal savior because here's a guy who took a horrible childhood tragedy and turned it into a 100-year media empire, but in story turned it into a meaningful way of fighting for justice and truth and all these other things. Great short duration personal save. A lot of times you're gonna have weird shit that you're gonna throw all in on for a little while. Just know that at some point it's gonna not do that anymore. It's a bit like these kinds of metaphors are a little bit like the Dumbo's feather idea. The elephant could fly without the feather, but it needed the feather to convince itself it could fly. And so sometimes metaphors like inner child and those kinds of things are those kinds of Dumbo feathers for other processes. But don't get caught up in the lingo rather than what it's trying to point to. And I do think trying to tie some of those things only to youth and to childhood are maybe a little bit tied to some of the 80s narcissism that they were coming out of and also trying to address at the same time.
I would say that they're more misguided. That they had a good concept, but then just kind of went down.
Well, you wanted to make weekend retreats out of it. You wanted to sell books, and
I know, but like God.
a good idea you only have to tell somebody once. A half-baked idea you can turn into an industry
that lasts 20 some odd years or
no. Men are from Mars, women are from Venus. Buy 30 copies of the book that says the same thing. Come to my workshops because this idea is so daft that I have to try and brainwash you for 6 hours a day on it. There's most insights, there's Ken Wilber, who I have a complicated relationship with conceptually at times. Ken Wilber had a very good line that always stuck with me. And it was the idea that no human is smart enough to be 100% wrong. Everybody, even the dumbest monkey you've ever run into in your life, knows something. There's some insight, there's some awareness, there's something that they've got. And so any teaching in some ways probably has something of potential value. The trick is knowing how to identify it when you run into it, and also when to give up trying to dig for it. Like there's a story that stuck in my head when a friend of mine had told me this particular proverb. It leads to a line that's just called digging for the pony. And where this comes from is there's a little kid who suddenly sees a field with a whole bunch of horse manure, like a big pile of horse manure. And the kid's doing kind of little kid calculations in his head about what happens. And suddenly they're running back in the house, and it's like, it's like, Uncle, I need a shovel. I really need a shovel. And the uncle's like, okay, fine, here's a shovel. And they run out right back to the mound of horse manure. And they start digging. And they start digging. And eventually, like, the uncle's like, after 3 hours of this, like, kid dedicatedly digging into this pile of manure, finally goes over. It's like, kid, what are you doing? And they're like, this much horse shit, there's got to be a pony in here somewhere. And like some stuff you got to figure out, like, even if it might have some value, maybe it's not worth digging through all of this. Like sometimes you are just digging for the pony on certain ideas. But I think, for most things, there's a certain amount of people got something right. And so it's figuring out how do you grab the right thing from the right insights, and what do you need for yourself too? Like just because somebody's right doesn't mean it matters to you. There's a lot of advanced mathematics that's 100% correct. It means nothing to me, because it doesn't impact the stuff that I'm necessarily interested in, nor do I have the skill set to really understand it. So, your own desires and capacities will drive what ends up being meaningful.
Hey, I'm thinking about changing stories, changing the story you're trapped in. And oftentimes people will be like, they've reinvented themselves numerous times, but they go back to the old material, like Dice Clay doing the
Sure.
rhymes. And
all else fails, everybody wants to hear hickory dickory dock.
So and if he's gone through a metamorphosis and is a different human being now, how does someone elegantly change the story without sort of doing a scorched earth or alienating people around?
The people that you've already been dealing with. I think that's hard. Like there's always a version of that kind of reminds me. It was a story I picked up from Robert Anton Wilson, but it was about of all people, Cary Grant. Like Cary Grant was actually like a kid from Liverpool by the name of Archie Leach. And like he came from no background, had no real confidence. He'd been a stilt walker in Coney Island. Like he had a whole kind of crazy life. But like Cary Grant was this, Hollywood leading man, confident, capable. And there's two things. Like somebody at one point, he says, like, when I see you on the big screen, Mr. Grant, I wish I was like that person. And Cary Grant was like, yeah, me too. And he had a moment. I think it's his gal Friday, where he makes a comment to, like, in the kind of ad-libbing that he's doing, the one that they kept, he ends up threatening someone like, hey, be careful. The last person who mouthed it off to me that way, his name was Archie Leach, and I cut him, ear to ear. And he's talking about himself, and like Cary Grant, as far as most of his life had gone, was like problematic drunk, had a lot of failed relationships, couldn't keep his shit together. Ironically, the thing that actually finally got him to get his act together was like in his late 50s, he was one of the first people to get involved with LSD research. And so like he had like in late life, he's the one who introduced Jack Nicholson to LSD. Like this is the story the hippies never tell you. Also along the same line, the guy in that time period who was the single biggest drug user that like made Nicholson go like, dude, you've gone too far. Mickey Dolenz from the Monkees. Dolenz was beyond everyone else. He is, and you look at him, you don't assume it. He was the most serious of all the Hollywood vampires. He outlasted all of them and was doing like 3 times more than any of them were, and no one would ever notice. But I do think, in terms of that kind of reinventing, I think it's harder for people in public positions. Like in terms of like looking at someone like Dice Clay is, I think, a good example is, and part of it's also who Clay's audience has been is a part of it too. Like someone like him who, I mean, a lot of his early career stuff is all this kind of like weird, almost avant-garde comedy, like just stuff that, what the fuck is he even doing up on that stage? But he kind of hit it with the nursery rhymes and all of that. The best artists who managed to kind of have careers where they managed to continue to develop and reinvent themselves, have an audience who are trying to do the same thing. If your audience is primarily knuckle draggers, they're never going to not be knuckle draggers. And unless you've done something to pull them along in the story of like, no, dude, I was a knuckle dragger too, and I'm still going to always be a little bit of that, but this is how I turn into somebody who's not just that. Like you can do that kind of a thing, but like in the end, the Andrew Dice Clay who's like trying to, make a career in Hollywood and become a serious actor and do all that kind of stuff. Like the folks who are like, yeah, but Dice, I want to hear you do like Hickory Dickory Dock again. Like they're never going to change because they haven't gone well on that journey. I think for most people, it's usually a case of there's a term that like the neurolinguistic programming guys sometimes use about time binding. And it's, when you talk to a lot of people, they often like talk about themselves like they're in a permanent identity that's never fixed in time. And the time binding trick is kind of like, I had a friend of mine from Staten Island who would always refer to himself as a schmuck. Like it was a permanent, unbound identity. He was a schmuck and he lived his entire life to prove it. Like every bad decision that he made reinforced his schmuckiness. And the easiest thing that he could have done was essentially even just, simply was like, yeah, up until now I've been a schmuck, but I'm starting to try and take steps to do something else. Recognize what you've been, recognize what the story was, and then figure out how to link the next thing that you're doing to what that kind of personal story was. And I think that there is always, even people who make big changes, even whatever their new changes, is still rooted in who they've been up until then. So, you know, situating some of that, giving people that sense of like, yeah, I'm doing this other thing now, but like, I'm always where I came from. You know, that whatever you end up doing, there's always this thing that comes in the background. That was the conflict for the kind of the Cary Grant story. He couldn't reconcile who he had become with where he had come from. And the thing that for him seemed to have been the reconciliator was the LSD experiences that he had on some of the California, funded, essentially government funded LSD studies before they made them illegal. And that's how come he became the kind of evangelist that he was in that, the community in Hollywood, because it had really, for him, it had finally put all the pieces that had been broken together. I don't think that that's necessarily like, if you've already been doing a lot of LSD, suddenly doing an LSD trick probably isn't going to make it better. Like, drugs aren't inherently the answer, but they're also not inherently the enemy. Some people need certain discrete states for certain kinds of changes to take place. In the same way that like some people have, I can't even imagine it, but some people actually do ultra marathoning intentionally. And like, that's the thing that they need to do in order to fully become who they need to be. And like, that's like, I hate steady state cardio. So the idea of ultra marathoning is the single scariest thing in the world to me. Cause like I have really good skills at boredom abatement, except doing that. So like, that's like the biggest hell for me, you could possibly give me. But some people need that. It's the thing that's effectively a part of who they are, that the practice, the experience itself is the thing that lets them see the stuff that they need. But I think that there is, in terms of that kind of reconciling your own stories, figuring out where do they connect, because they're usually not. If you told somebody, it might seem like it's a discrete break. Like it feels to you like I'm not that person at all anymore, and now I'm doing this other thing, and I don't know how to reconcile them. But ask the people who are close to you, and suddenly all this stuff that you think is so new and unique is like, you've been talking about that since you were 13. Like, what do you mean that this is some new thing? Like, this has always been something you were interested in. You're just now at the phase where you can make this a central part of what you're doing. So a lot of times I think people's stories do kind of have closer links than they might realize.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
You've been a wonderful audience. I think it's more startling that we've been having versions of these conversations since we were 13.
Yeah, my ex-boss used to do ultra marathons because his wife made him stop smoking weed, so he started running.
So he ran the fuck away?
Well, no, because they get high as fuck. They get high for days.
Yes,
it's
that's
like
your body destroying itself. His doctor, by the time when I was working with him, his doctor had prohibited him from running, and he was still running because his knees were destroyed. He's engaging in all the same processes, like the catabolic stuff.
His
that
wife,
kind of extreme activity does is the same as what the onset of death does to you.
That's not the first I've heard of people that have like maybe a past with drugs that maybe got a little out of hand, and then going into like extreme sports and diving into, now all of a sudden they're this this biker or this wall climber or
the deep-seated, like, I need to be engaged in weird, risky behavior that can potentially destroy me. Like, that's the subunit under what the other behavior is. And if you're smart, you can find stuff that's mostly healthy. But it's just, sometimes it's strange to see, And the other time, too, is you'll watch people who have, like, you'll see certain identities evolve for people. And that's one of the ones I find kind of interesting, like, and this was a sort of a secondhand story, but someone I knew had been friends with a guy who was a, big asshole association, but like had been like a white power skinhead for years. And then at some point, like as part of the kind of rehab after, having gone to jail for a little while, got involved with like some kind of like machinist related activities that got him, a job that kind of paid well. And the way that he used to have the kind of racial identitarian issues, suddenly he became a really good union organizer. That his ability to create the idea of tribal connections to other humans evolved from other people with my ethnic background to other people who do the same tasks that I do. And that the deep rooted part of that need for tribalism and for defending the tribe for real and imaginary affronts, like he found a more useful way of doing that same thing, but it was still rooted in the same fundamental structures. And that's usually, I mean, a lot of times one of the problems with people who talk a lot of big talk about self-change as an activity, if you really talk with them about what they're doing, a lot of times they're not really changing the structures of their lives, they're changing the decorations. They're still in the same house, they just changed the paint. They used to be a fundamentalist Christian, they've now become a fundamentalist yogic practitioner, or they read some Dawkins and now all they can do is throw Dawkins quotes at you. And that's that same issue. Sometimes if you don't intentionally really take on the structures, you're just changing the color of the decorations, which is fine because sometimes you just need to do that. Like some people, like the white power guy who becomes a union organizer, and a surprisingly effective one, they figured out how to take something that was, the value structures and life conditions that they were in, and found a healthier way of manifesting those values in the world. And for some stuff, even on a personal basis, the things you care about, there's stuff that you want to be doing. There's probably good, healthy ways of doing those same things, and some really problematic ones for yourself. And so, learning to get an idea of, well, what is it I really care about? Why do I really do these things? Like, what is it that's the, NLP jargon again, what's the positive intention behind why I do this? And if you can get close enough to whatever that original intention is, you go like, okay, well, how can I get there better? Because the way I'm currently translating whatever that intention is into what I'm doing with my life doesn't seem to lead to the end results that actually support what my intention is. So how do I get back to what is it I was really trying to do in the first place? The biggest one of those, and I love this story because it's one of those arcs I wish more people who went down a similar line would do. There's a PhD in parapsychology by the name of Sue Blackmore. And Sue had been someone who was doing when she was younger, she was doing graduate work in psychology. She got really stoned one night, thought she went to the moon, came back and decided she wanted to spend the rest of her life studying anomalous experiences, and ended up ultimately getting her PhD in parapsychology. She spent years studying people with claims of psychic powers, with all this kind of stuff, and trying to do serious research on it. And after almost a decade as a professional researcher in parapsychology, she had a day where something was like, none of this is true. None of this. I have been doing the statistical studies. I have been talking to the humans. I have been trying to actually collect the data. We're trying to do the science that we're claiming we're doing, and no shred of real happening here. But then she got back to it's like, yeah, but what got me here in the first place? And it was that question of that experience of altered consciousness. And so she kind of reinvented herself and has become one of the major figures in consciousness studies as an academic field and as a communicator on this topic, because her previous career and her experiences with parapsychology, and particularly, talking firsthand with people who are a little uneven, have made Sue a fairly good communicator of fairly complicated ideas. And so she's had this kind of second point in her life experience of having, been so serious about the subject she has a doctorate in it, and then coming out the other side in a completely different field that's still rooted in what those original questions had been. And I think that happens to, I think in some ways, I stole this from Mike Rowe of all people, who was the guy who used to do the show Dirty Jobs. And he was an opera singer who accidentally ended up a voiceover. It's a weird story all around. But Mike Rowe was originally an opera guy who accidentally ended up doing a bunch of online television, and then became a voiceover guy. And now he's doing shit for PragerU. Nothing is right in the world. But Mike Rowe had this line, mostly because of his experience with the show Dirty Jobs, where he would be dealing with people who were cleaning out septic tanks, and working at pig rendering factories, and all these stuff that when you think about it, this seems awesome. This seems like the worst fucking thing I could be doing. But when he would talk with them, these were the happiest people he knew. And the way that he kind of framed it is, someone coming from the background he had been in, particularly in the arts, everybody keeps trying to sell people on this idea oh, you should follow your passions. You should figure out the thing that you're really into, and you should go out and do it. And he kind of took it the other way. He was like, no, you should take your passion to whatever your opportunities are. Like the stuff that really moves you and you really care about, take it to the opportunities that are showing up in your life, and you'll figure out a way to translate it into that. You'll figure out a way to take it with you on whatever it is that you're dealing with. You know, you don't have to give up the stuff that you care about. You figure out how what you care about can be brought into whatever it is that you're doing. And I think that that's one of those really powerful reframes. You know, it's like, so the upside of having spent years dealing with people, you know, rendering pigs was this other realization that like there is this other way to orient things. And, you know, I think that sometimes, particularly that the way that we sell people on is like, oh, you should give up that, you know, you should give up that job that actually takes care of you and lets you pay for things so that you can finally go take up, you know, the solo synchronized swimming you've always wanted to do.
Yeah.
Okay, well, maybe you want to figure out what your actual passion is, and then figure out how do you match that passion to what the environment is. Like maybe you do want to do performance, maybe you do want to do those kinds of things, and figuring out how do you take that to what's really going on. You know, what your opportunities and possibilities are, rather than trying to like wreck everything you have to do something that maybe when you're actually doing it in real time isn't what you actually want to be doing. You know, or figuring out how do I do it and do the other things that I'm doing. You know, there are, I think that we have this is a disease of occultists, but it's a disease of a lot of people in the creatives world, where like you're whatever it is you really care about should be what you're doing to make money. And sometimes some people are better divided between vocations and avocations. Not everyone should do the job that they love. Some people should do the job that pays for the things that they love. And figuring out where you are at a given point in your life and what that you need to do those kinds of things, I think is worth doing. And I think the idea that the only value is, you know, people who are, you know, professionally doing the thing that they're passionate about. Not always. Doesn't work for everybody. It's not necessarily the life everybody needs. You know, there are a lot of things, like just because a thing is a hobby or a thing that you don't do as the main thing in your life doesn't make you do it any less. Doesn't mean your access and your passion for it is any less. And I think that there is we do a big disservice to a lot of people with that.
And sometimes doing the thing you love, if you try to take that and then make that into a career, it can kill it. You know, there's a lot of hobbies out there where it's like you can really enjoy it, but if you had to depend on it for a living, it probably wouldn't end in happiness.
Well, it turns you into something else a lot of times. Like there's a really good book that nobody read by Doug Rushkoff, which is ironic because some of his not good books everyone's read. But Doug had written a book called Get Back in the Box, and it was aimed at at essentially a professional audience. You know, people who were entrepreneurs, people who, you know, cared about what they were kind of making and doing in the world, and who had gotten to a place where, because, you know, they had had some success, like, you know, as a kind of a metaphor for what Doug was dealing with, it was like someone who really loved making shoes, and they were really good at doing shoes, and they got into like being able to make shoes professionally. They got into designing shoes. They were really good at it, and eventually they started making more and more money. And by the end of the process, all of their life is spent in board meetings trying to organize a company, when all that they had wanted to do was make shoes, and that's not what they do anymore. Now they're looking at, you know, financials, they're looking at all this other stuff, and what their capacities were is no longer the thing that they're doing, because they got into this monetizing racket. And there's nothing inherently wrong with monetizing the things you care about. Like, I'm not somebody who thinks that that's a problem, but, you know, there's a certain point where it's like, yeah, but the thing that you actually cared about was this, and because you've been doing it in this way, you've kind of lost the path. And trying to get back to, well, why did you do this stuff to start with? You know, and you see it in some ways in the business world, where like a business starts out with one purpose and eventually gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and suddenly there is no clear thing it does. It's one of these, you know, conglomerate holding companies that just consumes everything around it. You know, and figuring out from people who are in business, like, rather than just getting on this entrepreneurial game that a lot of people do of like, well, I have this thing I care about, and well, I built a business about it, and then I built a business about businesses, and then I now just business all the time. Like, that's not really the path a lot of people were doing. They wanted to do the thing they cared about and make money doing it. So, you know, knowing in some ways when to get off the cycle.
Well, and I think part of it, it actually kind of ties back to what I'm getting out of this conversation. And
Mhm.
your life is made up of chapters, right? Is pretty much what it, and things come to an end and new things start, and really looking at the next chapter and being conscious of
Yeah.
that, checking in on a continual basis of where are you at in your life, where do you want to be, are you heading in the right
Yeah.
direction? And it sounds like somebody who's done that, they're not checking in often enough to realize, like, wait,
Yeah.
this has gone far beyond what I wanted to do.
Yeah. Well, and professional lives will eat your whole existence left unchecked. Like that's, in the same way, I think I probably said this in some of the other meetings, that, there's kind of three areas you can watch people get their lives consumed in, that if you balance them, you can usually get more out of it. And it's the, professional lives, people will get completely consumed by them. People's personal lives, particularly primary relationships, like, people will just fall down holes of, their relationships completely. And then the kind of physical stuff, like, going back to folks who sort of gave up certain habits, like it's not uncommon to run into the guy who became like a full-time gym bro after having like, I quit drinking and now all I do is live in the gym.
Yeah.
And those things, that the physical dimension stuff, interpersonal stuff, business stuff, each one of those will try and eat your entire life if you let it. And sometimes the better thing to do is to learn how to play those three areas off of each other so that they keep you from getting pulled too far into any one of them. Not that you're setting them up in conflict, but setting them up that all three of them are kind of helping you do the thing you're trying to do anyway, rather than being the thing that's just going to try pulling you into it and be the only thing that you do. Because every activity just wants to be the only activity that eats your life.
Yeah. Really, I think the whole key word of this one is just consciousness, just thinking through every situation. Not every
Well,
situation.
trying to.
Exhausting.
I mean, everybody's going to have days where it's like, oh, how the hell did I get here?
Yeah.
And so there's a kind of a recognition, I think, in some ways that, you're always, there's this whole kind of grand fourth way, the material associated with G.I. Gurdjieff and P.D. Ouspensky, where it's the war against sleep and we're trying to awaken at all times. And, if you stay awake for too long, everything starts breaking down and you get kind of goofy.
Right.
The trick in some ways, and like their metaphor is sound, but it's, the reality of human experiences, that what you're better off is learning how to build a capacity to awaken when you need to, be able to see what's really going on in those moments of awakened awareness, and then make choices, take conscious action at that moment to try and set up circumstances that are both better for what you're trying to accomplish, but also maybe make it a little more likely you're going to wake up again. And knowing that you're going to go back to sleep. It's not going to be an everyday thing. You're going to have some days where you have a tremendous amount of clarity that you feel like, I can guide my life from this moment of clarity. And then like 2 days later, that's gone and you're in the middle of some other thing. And that's not a problem. That's actually how it's supposed to be.
Yeah. The way our brain works in terms of a lot of things that we do from memory and, on automatic, like I don't need to analyze every movement I do of pouring my kids milk, right? Like everything that and brushing your teeth, like that, by your brain having that, it frees you up. Number one, for just rest in your head, and then also to have those awakened moments. Because you're right. If you're consciously always aware, that's got to be exhausting as fuck.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you look at, in its own kind of tragic way, if you look at the kind of a lot of people involved with fourth way style work, that Ouspensky sadly was one of the people who fell into this, that push to try and prioritize, like, I am awake at all times, leads to this kind of, because you can't do it forever, because it's just not how awareness works. It's not how the brain works. It's not how any of these things happen. It's easy to get into like, well, I'm supposed to be this teacher of awakening, and yet I keep falling back to sleep, and there's something wrong here. And at the end, with Ouspensky, there's mostly like, well, I'm just going to drink myself to death and say, oh, this was a waste of time. And well, great for students here and that. But that, I think that there is that there's a tendency, because most of the kind of people who are wired towards esoteric wacky pantsery need drama in order to get themselves motivated. You need a big, crazy project. It's not just a case of like, I should probably learn how to floss. It's like, I will learn to floss so that I may conquer the world in the name of the forces of darkness. You know, big drama for little things. That leveraging that drama to a certain extent is really useful for some parts of life, but can become really a bigger problem later. And, you know, the kind of war against sleep idea from the fourth way traditions. There's like a side conversation that's been going on in chat that I occasionally like pops up on my iPad, so I keep reading it. But you know, in terms of the that kind of, you know, fourth way tendency, that idea of the big metaphor of the war against sleep and all of that, it's a good initial motivator, but it's bad for long-term practice because it just kind of blows everything out.
Well, to bring us back to something you mentioned earlier about painting ourselves into corners,
sure,
and whatnot, I have a recurring problem where, well, let's say due to, you know, lifelong trauma and whatnot, there are lots of lessons and whatever that I've consciously rejected, but
sure.
you know, I've consciously rejected them. But being in therapy, I've come to realize that shit's still affecting me, you
sure.
know? Yeah. And I don't know how to turn it off because it's happening on a subconscious level. And the result is continuous self-sabotage. And,
sure.
you know, it's really frustrating because I've been spinning my wheels for a long time. And that whole thing when I first joined the conversation about, you know, being stuck and just, you know, like you said, painting yourself into corners really, really resonated for me. And I don't know, well, where to go with that.
It is, I mean, if you've got a lot of stuff that's happening on that kind of subconscious level, part of the challenge in some ways is knowing that like your problems are probably always going to be there in some ways. You know, things like therapy help untangling some of the more really troubling messes, but some of that stuff is just part of who you're going to be. And the trick is kind of continuing to grow around them. Like, don't reject the insights if you can, but recognize them for what they're for. You know, if you're doing stuff because there is, you know, past negative experiences and things, and you're doing weird defensive stuff, you know, just know it's happening. Like, get a sense like, oh yeah, that's that thing I do.
That's the stage I'm at.
Away from it completely. You can't really stop it, but you can sort of learn how to accept it.
Okay.
I know, so it's not the sexiest answer.
It's not the sexiest answer, you know, and you know, the thing is the therapist doesn't have anything better for me either.
No, and honestly, in a lot of ways, there really aren't better answers.
No, it really
you can't force growth. You can't, and the other, sadly, and this is be a lot easier if you could. You can't skip stages.
Yeah.
You gotta grow through what you gotta grow through.
Yeah.
I wish there was a montage button. Like nobody's business. I wish that there was a little button you could hit, and like it'd be one of those 1980s training montages where like at the end we raise the bar and it's all over in like 5 minutes. You know, but that sadly life doesn't have the montage option. So you have to unfortunately grow through everything you gotta grow through.
I'm on it.
Good.
Yeah.
Nope, good doing it, and you know, having somebody on a therapeutic level to be able to talk that stuff out with is really important.
Hard finding a competent person.
Well, yeah, it's a field that attracts a lot of uneven people.
Yeah, I was initially a psychology major, so I'm aware. You know, I haven't met a single person who is either a psych major or a therapist or something that didn't have something, you know, that they were trying to figure out either about themselves or the people around them. You know,
sure. Well, there's the stuff that
why
drives
else would
them
you go
into
into that? Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So, I mean, some of them just like doing unfortunate things to lab rats and undergraduates. You know,
That's
there's
why
always
that's
that.
why I dropped out. That's why I dropped out was because of the animal experimentation, which was
Sure.
when it was still really big back when I was initially in college back in the mid 90s.
Yeah.
Chimp experiments and stuff. You know, they were yeah.
Mhm.
Anyway.
Yeah, there's I don't talk a lot about it, but there's essentially an old chimp retirement home that I'm an occasional donor to, largely because like they are our nearest relatives on the planet, and we've spent a long time doing a lot of awful things to them.
Yeah, it was my professor. It was a really odd experience. He was really a great professor, but he was really discouraging us from going into the field because of this because you couldn't, a BA was essentially worthless, and a master's required
Yeah.
animal experimentation.
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah. So then I moved on to anthropology, but you know.
Oh, it's a terrible habit.
Yeah. Yeah, well, it was.
God, I fell down that rabbit hole years ago. It's awful.
I'm still in that rabbit hole because then I tried to, you know, I dropped out of college and then I went back recently. But in between that, I tried to do, you know, I'm going to be an entrepreneur, blah, blah, blah. That didn't, that was, you know, spinning my wheels in a different way. I found out that the general public wasn't really interested in my visions of whatever. In this case, it was landscape design. But it was, yeah, they don't want what you have to offer. They want you to do what they imagine is doable.
Right.
And it's not, I'm in LA and it's not realistic. So, you know, it's like plants grow.
So this is desert. I want nothing but tropical plants.
You know, they want it to look grown in for 15 years the day that you're done with the job. And that's doable, but then it looks like shit 3 years later. But anyhow, so here we are. But the journey continues.
So it's about 8:15. You know, I know we've had a few folks drop off, otherwise gone in other directions. I'm still up for the conversation, but if we're coming towards a natural ending, I'm also okay with that. Sounds like we may have a natural ending.
Yeah, it sounds like.
It's been a pleasure talking to everybody this evening.
It's been really nice.
We'll be catching up again in a month. I'm easy enough to get a hold of.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Talk to you all soon. Take care.
You too.